wine tasting. So, Vahan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hagop. First, I have to warn the audience that currently I am in a very remote mountaintop in Armenia. It's about 2 hours from Yerevan, 2,000 meters above sea level. And sometimes the last few days here, the internet has been a little bit sporadic. So what I have done, I have 3 different options for Wi-Fi. And if one gets disconnected, I'll immediately jump to the other. So if all of a sudden I disappear in the middle of a talk, don't panic. I will turn on the next option that I have and we will continue. But that's where we are now. The topic that was suggested or we came to agreement with is about rethinking the economic model of Armenia. And in many ways, this was triggered by by the situation after the war, but many of the issues here equally apply, if not some of them better apply before the war. Some of them have become more urgent after the war, and some of them have become actually more difficult to implement after the war, but they're equally applicable today as they were before. First, I hear a lot of excuses among Armenians, and by the way, among some other small countries, relatively small countries, where they try to tend to blame a lot of their economic problems and sometimes even their military problems on their size. But small doesn't mean weak necessarily. Small doesn't imply that you have to remain weak or you cannot surpass or overcome the disadvantages of your size. So I strongly believe that just because Armenia is a small country, and especially a small country in a tough neighborhood, it does not mean that it has to remain weak economically and even militarily. But that's outside the realm of this talk. So obviously there are no economies of scale when you don't have the size, but there are a lot of other advantages that small countries have. They're more agile, they're more adaptable, some of their social problems are less complicated and more easily solvable, especially in Armenia. We don't have that diversity and therefore ethnic issues and social issues as bad as in some other countries. But the conventional way of analyzing Armenia's economy is basically to focus on some of the key basic problems like infrastructure needs. We all know, whoever has been to Armenia knows something about the infrastructure problem, the roads, the road conditions and other utilities and so on. The energy security issue always comes up because Armenia is highly dependent on imported fossil fuels, but that is probably one of the easiest parts to solve. Export promotion is an issue. Agricultural development is a major burning issue now because the agricultural sector in Armenia is probably the most developed relative to its potential. And then there are the classical, more recent issues is to put emphasis on information technology and technological development. How do we encourage direct foreign investment? How do we create more affordable credit for businesses? Because credit here is extremely expensive. These are all very valid issues. And these are all issues, though, that have been analyzed almost ad nauseum. And some of these, I mean, the solutions to a lot of these are analytical level and are kind of clear and obvious. The problem is implementing them requires either a lot of resources, which Armenia doesn't have, or sometimes, as importantly, the necessary political will and determination, which also Armenia hasn't had since independence, to address some of these issues, even though at a purely analytical level, the solutions have been outlined. So even though these issues are very important, I don't want to dwell on them. They've been analyzed, overanalyzed. The answers are clear. One day, if you want, we'll have a session and we'll tell you all the answers and why those answers haven't been implemented. What I'd like to focus on today is something entirely different. I'd like to focus on a lot of the intangible issues, not this kind of concrete Armenia-specific, but they're still Armenia-specific in many ways, that small countries can use to overcome the disadvantage of their size. So I'm going to put this in a very outline form. I'm going to talk about 8 points, and then I'm going to conclude with a few comments about the issue of the necessity of a government, proper government, and the culture of statehood. Probably the first point in terms of overcoming disadvantage of size is innovation. The main engine of wealth creation in a small country has to be invention and innovation rather than just trade, finance, service industries like tourism and so on, which is fine. All of those are fine. But that's not where the advantage of scale lies. More importantly, those create income and wealth, but they don't go beyond that. Innovation and invention goes much beyond that. It goes into value propositions in diplomacy. It gets into countries' recognition. It makes the country matter in the global economic scene. But to enable innovation and invention, the most important thing is dedicated R&D. R&D spending is a must. If you look at many successful small countries, their R&D spending relative to GDP is sometimes much higher than even the large countries, much higher than the United States. In Israel, it's over 4%, 4.3% of GDP. In South Korea, it's almost 4%. In Singapore, it's around 2%. US is only 2.5%, so it's much lower than the others. China is lower. Small countries that have excelled in inventions and innovations and that have made them a place for themselves on the global economic map, this has been one of their persistent features, and not just 1 year or 2 years, but over decades. But it doesn't end there. It's not enough to have that R&D and come up with wonderful inventions. There has to be an entirely separate mechanism for funding early stage, high risk innovations and ventures. And this is something which some countries are very good at, and others, even though they're good at R&D, haven't yet graduated into this. Countries have set up for startups, they've set up grants, mechanisms to encourage venture capital, efforts to lure especially foreign development funds into government-backed ventures. There is a specific science behind the mechanism to support the commercialization of scientific inventions. Now, inventions are one thing, but to commercialize them is an entirely different deal. I never forget when I first came to Armenia, it was still Soviet Union, 32 years ago, it was 1989. And we were put in this government guest house, and we came down one morning to have breakfast. And it was towards the collapse, beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I saw a group of Japanese businessmen in the dining room, in the breakfast room, having breakfast. I was shocked. In those days, I used to go to Japan a lot. And so I had the courage and the thing to approach them, say, excuse me, what are you doing here? Because I know Japan and I know Armenia, and this is the first time I've been here. You seem to be familiar with the whole situation. Guess what? They were there looking for patents, because in those days, during the Soviet Union, there was a lot of funding for basic research. There was a lot of valuable basic research in the entire Soviet Union, including in Armenia. And these Japanese businessmen wanted to come buy the patents for 2 cents on the dollar because they knew how to commercialize an invention. But the local culture, they had no clue how to commercialize a scientific invention. So that's an issue which some countries have developed over time, but it's not common everywhere. Another issue here when it comes to innovation is the transfer of military R&D to civilian and vice versa. Again, I've studied about 10 different countries to put this whole thing together, and not the experience of not a single one is fully applicable on any other. These countries are quite different in every other aspect, other than some of these key features in which they have managed to overcome their disadvantage of size. Now, one of the big beneficiaries, by the way, of high tech and innovation and invention should be the agricultural sector. We often tend to think of the agricultural sector as not something subject to or benefiting from innovation and invention. That's not true. And there are so many examples of that also. The second point, which is really intangible, is flexible and fluid systems. And this is where Armenia has a long, long way to go. This is a situation where there are so many rigidities in the structures, in processes, in hierarchical relationships, both in companies and business, where there is one boss, he makes all the decisions. Those of lower rank, usually, even if they have very good ideas, don't have the right or the courage to express them. So there's no communication, there's no free flow of ideas. This is devastating for a small country. This kind of thing, big countries, very large economies can get away with. This kind of thing, China can get away with, or even the United States can get away with. But this kind of thing, little countries cannot get away with, because there's too much waste, and that waste doesn't get lost in the shuffle as it does in a large countries. In this case, also, every step of every process should be a new learning curve, which means if the system is truly fluid and flexible, not only there is considerable communication from lower ranks to higher ranks in the hierarchy, but also this means that the standardization of processes are minimized, questioned. It's not like routine, and standardization is not easily accepted in a system that is fluid and free. Now, again, in a large economy, standardization can be a big saving. It's an economic issue. But because in a large economy, there is so much R&D and other things going on that the system can self-correct by new inventions. You don't have to self-correct intrinsically as you go along. But in a small economy, you're wasting a lot of self-correcting potential by standardizing too much. And because then if you question every step and you make every step as a new learning process, you become an entirely different and much more fast-moving and self-improving economic system. In this system, for example, entitlements are absolute poison. There should be no entitlements in this system. And so without this kind of implied dynamism that is described here, very dynamic, very fluid, free flow of ideas, no rigidities in structures, in hierarchies, and so on. In that system, then a small country can compete a lot better. And in fact, in certain areas, they can beat a much larger, but much more rigid and standardized economic system. The third point I'd like to make in this is synergies. Here also, Armenia is not there yet, but isn't as bad as in the case of fluidity and hierarchical rigidity. Now, to create these competitive efficiencies, progress in one area should naturally be able to benefit other areas. If you have a technological advancement in one area, it should lead to a new business, which should lead to economic advancement, which should lead to productivity gains in other areas. Like Hagop mentioned, this incredible invention that is in Armenia 10 times better than anywhere else. That's great, but if it doesn't translate into economic gains and it doesn't diffuse into some other parts of the economy, then it stays there. It's still great, but it stays there. It doesn't give competitive advantage to the economy or to at least a sector of the economy. People here talk a lot about creating islands of excellence in the economy, for example. Now, islands of excellence are a great idea, okay? You can have many different islands of excellence, and then you don't worry about the overall integrated economic package. You worry about your own island of excellence, and you can do very well at it. But unless those islands of excellence get eventually integrated into the broader economy with direct benefits and multiplier effects, then you're not getting the benefit of it in an economic sense. So I'm talking about the macro economy now and what it needs to be competitive despite of its small size. In this sense, small countries simply do not have the luxury of scale to duplicate parallel efforts to to multiple different efforts, in each case duplicate the effort to meet different strategic needs. They have to talk together. They have to, in order to multiply the success in one area 10 times, it has to be transitive, it has to be talking to the rest of the economy. In this sense, therefore, small countries cannot afford specialization. It is very funny. Specialization or extremist specialization is a good thing in general, right? But in a small country, extremist specialization is not a good thing because people have to be very good at many things. Otherwise, they do not recognize the applicability of an advancement somewhere else to them if they're not good at that other thing as well as in their area. So this ability to integrate different achievements in different parts of the economy requires that you are good at many things rather than very good at one thing. So multidisciplinary approaches to solutions become central to this process. And one of the ways in which the synergies can be established is to create what's known as business clusters or hubs, economic hubs. I know something about this because in a previous lifetime, I used to do energy hubs, and I'll come to that in a second. But here, the idea is when you have a certain sector of the economy, it has interrelated activities. For example, if you have agriculture, animal husbandry goes with it, production of processed foods goes with it, which is an entirely different industry than planting agricultural products, but they're together. Exports of the processed goods is a totally different specialization. But if you combine all this, where there are the synergies between them, the efficiencies, they're all together in one cluster, then you're creating an economic hub with built-in efficiencies, which alone, each one of them alone wouldn't be able to have. There are many other examples of this, but one of the things that bother me about Armenia in this area, the lost opportunities, is in the mining sector. Armenia has some mines. In fact, in general, some of the mining in Armenia shouldn't even be there, but let's say it's there. But to just extract natural resources from the ground and sell them raw outside for hard cash is an enormous waste. Because in order to do the mining in the first place, there are a lot of related services. Exploration, production, extraction, each has its own value in the chain of economics, which we're foregoing to other companies. And then once the product is extracted, the mineral, whatever it is extracted, you are foregoing enormous value by not processing and refining and marketing it yourself, by selling the raw mineral outside for somebody else to benefit from the long value chain of processing it. To have all this together from the upstream, in other words, the exploration on production side of minerals, to the downstream, all the way down to the refining and marketing side of the products, is a complete energy. In energy, it's energy, but in copper, it's copper. Molybdenum, it's molybdenum, doesn't matter. It's a cluster, it's an economic hub, and we're foregoing a lot of value there. Small countries cannot afford to send all this value outside the country. The fourth point, which is very much applicable to Armenia, is monopolism. This is a post-Soviet oligarchic system, okay, that we have still today after 31 years of independence. And this post-Soviet oligarchic system is founded on monopolies. There is a symbiotic relationship between big monopolies and the government. They thrive on each other. One makes the other possible. One reinforces the other. And there's also, interestingly, a symbiotic relationship between the monopolies and the population at large, because they've learned to work together. Even the population is beginning to rely on the monopolies because they're very reliable in providing certain goods and services, even though they do it monopolistically. The problem is that monopolies do not fit in this dynamic, fluid system that I explained. That's why they resist any kind of reform. They create very low participation in the economy, which automatically restricts dynamism and creativity. And also this low participation is very kind of disruptive in the sense that when a very small percentage of resources is carrying the entire burden of economic growth, something breaks in the socioeconomic system. That's not a sustainable and not a balanced economic system. In this case, aside from just monopolies, to create that dynamism, I think the role of and participation of women in the economy becomes very important. And that's stifled right now too in Armenia. So in the very least, I think in Armenia now, they should remove all monopolistic obstacles to new businesses at least. Controlling the old ones that they've already established and is proving to be extremely difficult. Okay, it was tried in the last 2 years. Don't believe that it succeeded. All the old monopolists are still there and they have deals with the government, even with the current government. So that symbiotic relationship between monopoly and government was not broken by the Velvet Revolution. So I'm hoping that at least the new sectors, this high growth, dynamic tech sector, IT sector, whatever, these new sectors that are coming up, at least those will be exempt from the influence of these very large economies. And over time, those will outgrow. They will grow so fast past that traditional businesses that they will establish a new base with this more competitive and dynamic model rather than the old monopolistic model. Well, it's late enough here to have wine, but I'm having water. I have, you know, this is not wine. Now, the fifth point is to have always, over time, to deliberately build a niche in the global supply chain. This is very important. You cannot, not only you have to focus, you concentrate on synchronizing and integrating and creating synergies within your own economy, but you have to think about how am I going to fit in the global economy, not just by exports, but also by fitting in the production cycle of the global economy. That's where you make a true competitive impact on the world. And that's how some of the more successful countries, small countries have done it. So to punch above its weight globally, Armenia needs to find a niche in the global supply chain. Now, some developing countries have found their niche by providing very critical or important raw materials like oil and gas production. That's a niche, everybody needs it. So the world depends on me, okay? That's why the whole world went to war for Kuwait when Iraq invaded Kuwait. But the whole world did not come to war for Artsakh when Turkey and Azerbaijan invaded, because there was no strategic resource to protect. At least that's one of the reasons. But Armenia, in the case of Armenia, that same thing that plays the role of strategic resource as oil or very strategic metals should come in something else. And there are examples where that can come. And that should come through, again, technology and innovation. If you supply technologically superior but critical parts in industries producing something very important, and you can make it better and cheaper, people will buy your stuff. And there are so many examples of this. In fact, today, most of the high-tech items produced, including the famous Bayraktar drones of Turkey, by the way, so many of its parts are manufactured outside and they're sent to Turkey to be put together. When you're producing a high-tech item, you buy the part from the source that produces it the best and the cheapest and can innovate constantly. Armenia can find a niche like this. It can be anywhere. It can be in a medical field, medical technology field. It can be in advanced robotics. It can be in communications. It can even be in renewable energy, by the way, which there are some advancements here. It can be anywhere, as long as it is a critical input. It's a niche in the global supply chain that without your input, it will either be disrupted or it will not be as effective, as cheap. Then you're securing yourself a competitive edge in the global economy. To do this, I think Part of what we need to do this in Armenia is there, which is the private sector initiatives in advancement in some of these technologies. But it needs a coordination with the government. I mean, government bodies in Armenia responsible for economics and trade, competitiveness should coordinate with the private sector technological advances that are going on. Now, to stay in the game, it's not enough to have that thing once. Here is the trick. Once you have that critical piece, that niche in the supply chain, you have to be the one that constantly improves it. You have to make your own product obsolete by improving it constantly so that you're never left out of the game. If you allow somebody else a year from now to come and create a better widget than you, then you're out of the game. So once you capture that edge in an area, you stick to it, you improve it, you don't let anybody else steal it from you. The sixth point in this is, of course, the never-ending theme of the role of the diaspora. Now, it is something that I feel very strongly about, that the brain drain can be and should be a two-way street. So far in Armenia, we haven't, well, we were just beginning to get there, but things got disrupted. Those who leave the country should have an incentive and a meaningful reason to come back, and to come back with new experience and expanded knowledge. This can be done. The diaspora actually has been one of the most underutilized resources, and it's difficult to point the finger at one thing or another on this. The government, I've seen a lot of cases where the government carries the major burden from the beginning, okay? I'm talking from since independence on this. But Armenian government now cannot afford in this environment to not to fully utilize the diaspora resources. I mean, they should, for example, they should look for employees of Armenian origin in high-tech industry all over the world. Why not? There are Armenian employees at very high level, in technological level, in Microsoft, Google, Apple, Oracle, you name it, IBM, you have them. You have the same in Russia, you have the same in Europe. Find first meaningful way to engage them in Armenia. Have a program, have a separate ministry if you want, I don't care, but have a system where you can attract this talent, not just attract them to come say hi or shake hands or give medals. No, attract them to be meaningfully engaged and to be meaningfully absorbed in the local environment in Armenia, and to be able to contribute something meaningful. Aside from tech, there are other areas, by the way, that this should happen. I strongly believe that the diaspora should, this charm offensive, okay, this talent search that I'm talking about should extend to teachers, to legal expertise, especially international legal expertise, to diplomatic skills, even military R&D and intelligence, like retired military officers around the world. Venture capitalists, Armenian government should have it. This is something that I don't think the Ministry of Diaspora ever did in the old days when there was a Ministry of Diaspora, and I don't think today the High Commissioner's Office is doing something at this level. So this two-way brain traffic should be a priority if you want to have a tech-driven dynamic economy. You have to. You cannot afford to waste a major part of a national resource, which is the diaspora. Now, the seventh point I have here is demographic management. And this is another thing that really pains me. Probably the biggest failure of both Armenia and Artsakh since independence has been that the population has declined in Armenia and not increased in Artsakh in any significant way. Every country you compare Armenia with in terms of size, they had a deliberate program to populate the country, to settle in the country. I took a few countries and looked at the first 30 years of their independence. First 30 years of independence in Israel, population grew 3.5% per year, quadrupled. South Korea, it grew over 2% per year. Singapore grew over 2% per year. Armenia, it fell 0.5% per year every year for 30 years. That's serious stuff. You cannot run an economy with a declining population. You just can't. And this decline in population had all kinds of reasons. Okay, first of all, poor economic conditions, fine, it's a vicious cycle, one leads to the other, but also poor opportunities, chronic corruption, social injustice. Sometimes even there was, I have witnessed in the early days when I used to come in, and later on, there was even deliberate government encouragement to have people leave, because if people leave, less headache, less popular unrest, uh, we can manage. Only the happy folks remain. They're easy to manage. Those who leave are those who are upset. Let them go. This comes to something I call the lack of uh, culture of statehood, and I'll come talk about that. If we had a real faith in our own statehood, we would never have this policy of encouraging, at least tacitly encouraging, if not actively, exodus. So we're 30 years too late, but we're not too late. We're late. I think now it's going to be much more difficult after the defeat in the war, but it's even more critical to start a major and very diligent repopulation strategy for both Armenia and it's not just propaganda. It's not come to your motherland. No, as I was saying, for the scientists, you have to have meaningful ways to engage them, give them, make it easy. Give whoever wants to come easy, residency, citizenship, whatever. Give them opportunities, give them even assistance in some cases. We have vast areas of agricultural land which are not cultivated. It's not just about a few scientists I'm talking about. I'm talking about populating, developing, cultivating a country so that you can own it. If you don't do that, if you don't live here, if you don't have a population growth, if you're not cultivating, if you're not living on your land and living off your land, you don't own it. And if we're going to overcome our disadvantage of size, we have to have the density of population. And one of the problems in the past 30 years, and believe me, I've been here for the last 32 years, every year, since before independence. And I've seen all the 3 presidents and the current prime minister. And I'll tell you, there is a reluctance to share power with the diaspora. That's been one of the major impediments. And that kind of reluctance to share power has been very destructive. It's the post-Soviet, again, oligarchic defensive system, because people come from outside with new ideas, reform, this and that. The oligarchic system, as they know it, and that symbiotic relationship between government and oligarchs can no longer survive, or at least it will be endangered. But now, at least for the sake of saving the state, that has to happen. The 8th point is something kind of unrelated to this, but something that really worries me, what I call the wolf in sheep's clothing. What worries me is this. Right now, population, I see it every day in the streets in Yerevan, in the villages, all over the region state I've traveled in the past week. What I see is this. There's a desperate need, yearning for peace. They're tired of war. Peace and some economic relief. There is incredible unemployment in Armenia right now. There's no work. Especially here in the villages, it's really sad. And this is why everybody wants to leave. Partly, the departure now, the new wave of exodus is caused, number 1, by this economic hardship, and number 2, by the fear of another war. And the government also is desperate to show some hope of something going to improve. Now, in this desperation, one wants to show hope, the other wants to see hope. We have a situation where the thing they can grab on right now is the promise of opening up borders with Turkey and opening borders with Azerbaijan and Russia and starting trade, and everything will be fine because there are peace dividends if we open borders and have peace. I think this is what I call the most vicious wolf in sheep's clothing, because I think this is going to be a disaster. And I'm not talking, believe me, I'm not talking emotionally here. I'm not saying, oh, as an Armenian, I don't want to trade with Turkey. No, There's no emotion. It's pure economic science. Okay, if you look at it, trade with Turkey for Armenia will destroy the Armenian economy in about a year, is my prediction. A few oligarchs will get very rich who import a lot of Turkish goods. Local industry will basically die. Agriculture will totally die. And a lot of services will die. The local construction will die. Turks will take over. And I'm not making this up. This is the kind of thing that we saw happen between Turkey and Georgia. Now, there are very sophisticated policies to counter all this, but I don't have any faith that the current government has those policies or even understands the risks. Let me give you just a simple sense of what's involved here. First, there is the issue of size and scale. I mean, Turkey has, per capita basis, forget that they are 80 plus population. Here it's only 2 plus population. Forget that. Per capita, their GDP is more than twice Armenia's. Their exports are 50 to 60 times more than Armenia's. But forget all that. Let's look at some institutional things. Both Armenia and Turkey are members of something called the World Trade Organization, WTO. WTO, if you are a member, it gives you certain obligations and privileges. And you cannot freely protect your own industry from foreign imports if you're a member of WTO. You cannot sell cheap artificially to a foreign country. It's breach of WTO rules. Now, Turkey has a huge number of products which over the years, they have managed to negotiate with WTO and to make them exempt from WTO restrictions. These include a lot of agricultural products, and these include a lot of building materials. This is why a Turkish construction company goes to Georgia, bids on a construction project, at least 20% cheaper than the cheapest Georgian company, and they win the bid. It's not a fair playing field. They have mastered this art of playing with these things. Similar issues exist with the EU. There is this thing called GSP+, the Generalized System of Preferences. Both Armenia and Turkey are members, but Turkey has a huge advantage over Armenia at being member of this thing. I'm not going to get into technical details. There is something called non-tariff barriers. I worked years with Japan and Germany for the US Trade Commissioner on this issue. They don't put tariffs. No, everything is fair. You have 10% on this product tariff. I have 10%. So let's trade. But there are so many non-tariff barriers that if you go to let's say you have a product you want to sell in Turkey, to find that market, then to find the channels of distribution, it will take you years. Whereas Armenia is an open book for Turkey. In fact, Armenians facilitate to bring Turkish products here. Turks don't even have to work at it. I mean, the Armenian market was flooded with Turkish products before even opening borders. So they can come and flood this market with cheap Turkish products in a matter of months and totally stifle local production. This is something that people don't appreciate enough, I think. Then there's now here is another thing. Turkey has major incentives, investment incentives for small and medium industry enterprises, which are export-oriented. They give them so much incentives that these export-oriented small and medium enterprises can manufacture and be very competitive overseas anywhere, without tariffs, without any other things. This is a domestic policy, right? They're giving them investment incentives, tax holidays, all kinds of things to make them competitive overseas. It's not a direct violation of WTO rules. They have mastered this art. They are way ahead of us in this game. On the economic sphere, we're like toddlers, they're marathon runners. And here we are, we think naively that we open the borders, open trade with Turkey will prosper. It's not going to happen. There are other things. I don't want to go into every detail here. There's intellectual property issues. Now, 5 years ago, I studied this. I'm a little rusty on it, but I remember clearly. Intellectual property, Turkey has very perfect rules on the book. Same rules as European Union, by the way. But the implementation of those rules are totally messed up. It is, and deliberately messed up. So there are incredible opportunities for foul play on items that are subject to intellectual property. Those protections are not there, and they create very unfair competitive situations for exporters into Turkey and competitive for them as they export. The point I'm trying to make is that today, the only hope what the government has to dangle in front of the people and the people are looking for is this hope of economic improvement because, okay, we signed this terrible peace, but one good thing is going to come out of this terrible peace, and that is opening borders and starting trade. In fact, that's the second most deadly blow. It's not the hope to the economy. I hope I can convince them here. It hasn't been easy so far, but that's something that I worry a lot about. In fact, that's the tip of the iceberg. Now, if we take this further, if we all of a sudden, God forbid, we give Turkish and Azerbaijani nationals the right to buy property in Armenia, and I'm not just talking about an office in Yerevan, property, thousands of hectares in a place that I am here, and I've seen people who want to buy that, then I swear I'm not being alarmist or they can come buy the whole country 10 cents on the dollar. They don't even have to fire a bullet. That's how vulnerable Armenia is today. And this is the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing. I don't want to depress you. There are ways out of this. It's not as desperate. This is probably, I'm painting the worst case scenario. I don't think it's going to happen because there's so much opposition internally also to all of this. Not everyone is buying this promise. But what bothers me is that if the government is so desperate to show something good and the people is so desperate to see something good, and this is all they got right now, they may actually push this forward. There's going to be enormous resistance, but they may actually push it. These were my, how are we, am I talking too much? How am I doing on time?
You're fine, you're fine.
Sorry, I tend to get carried away with this stuff. Now, I'm just going to say a few more words about something that very near and dear to my heart too, and that is the whole issue of culture of statehood and the need for a proper government. Before we do any of these things I described, before we realize this potential, before we do anything, we have to have a government and we have to have a state. Every global success story that I've known, I've studied, has a competent government behind it. There's no exception. And these are totally diverse countries, from Sweden, something like that, all the way to Singapore, to South Korea, to Israel. There's no similarities between these countries when it comes to their history, the threats they face, or anything else, or their culture, or whatever. Nothing in common, except one thing. They succeeded economically because of competent government policies. I've done this for 30 years. I can tell you with great assurance this is true. So there's no alternative to a competent, dedicated government in Armenia. And I will add more. I will say 100% loyal to the Armenian state with a vision and determination to create a strong, defensible, globally competitive country and economy. If we don't have this, then I'm talking to the beautiful mountains here in Vayotzor. But one of the fundamental weaknesses of Armenian nation in general, and this is not anybody's fault, okay, is that in spite of our very rich culture and cultural heritage, faith or history or whatever you want to call it has deprived us of a culture of statehood. We don't know what a state is. We don't have an appreciation of statehood. In the last 646 years, there's been an independent sovereign Armenian state for only 32 years, 32 out of 646. And even that 32 is divided between 2 years in the First Republic and 30 years in the Third Republic. In the middle, there was the Second Republic, which was a republic. It had borders, it had internal governing privileges, but it was not sovereign, it was not independent during the Soviet Union. Now imagine a nation that for centuries has lived under the rule of bigger empires. We've lived, even in Armenia, I'm not talking people in diaspora only, okay? Even in Armenia here, people have lived as subjects of either the Russian Empire or Ottoman Empire, or lately the Soviet Empire or the Persian Empire. As subject of these foreign empires, people have been conditioned, their brain cells have been conditioned to appease a more powerful ruling class for economic benefits, security, and for physical security. That's all we care about. I'm exaggerating, but I'm not really. If you think, if you scratch the surface, go deep enough into the psyche, why some of the government failures I described earlier, it's because of this lack of statehood. We are not, as a nation, we don't have a culture and tradition of nurturing our own state, independent and free and sovereign. We don't have it historically, which means we don't have a culture of sovereignty, we don't have a culture of citizenship, we don't have a culture of governance, we don't have a culture of security, we don't even have a culture of operational patriotism. We have plenty of what I call emotional patriotism. Emotional patriotism has evolved over time because of the nostalgic notion of a lost motherland. That we have plenty of. We hear one beautiful song and we're all, wow, wow, we're patriotic. It's emotional patriotism.
Good evening.
Sorry? Did someone interrupt? I mean, if there is a question, I don't know.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
This lack of sovereign state tradition runs very deep. You know, capitulating easily to a stronger power comes from this tradition. So state level decisions in this case are made not by really state level policymakers, but on paper we have everything. On paper we have the structure. We have a government, we have legislative, executive, and judicial branches. They're supposed to be independent. We have almost all the necessary laws, but nothing works as it should. We have very weak checks and balances in government, and this has been a major problem. I don't think the judiciary has ever been really independent in Armenia. I don't think an average Armenian citizen stands a chance to win a fair case in an Armenian court against a much more powerful or richer adversary. I don't believe it. And they don't believe it. Armenians don't. So it never happens even anymore. So, and power has been absolute. Before it was the power of the presidency. Later now it's the power of the prime minister. It's absolute, especially if the prime minister has majority in parliament. It's absolute. So if the political economy of Armenia is going to take advantage of all those points that I mentioned earlier, first you have to have a government. And I may sound very pessimistic, by the way, but I'm extremely optimistic. If I was as pessimistic as I sound, I wouldn't be in Armenia. I'm very optimistic. I think there is a whole new generation that's waking up here. I'm in touch with some of them, not all of them. I think people are fed up with all the symptoms that I just described about lack of statehood, about lack of, people not there 100% dedicated to the concept of a truly free, independent, and prosperous Armenia. I think there is a whole new movement, and this war has in fact become a wake-up call. And I'm very optimistic, and we have to keep plugging at it, and that's all it takes. But the solutions are there. The outline is there. We've done the analysis both for conventional challenges of Armenia and for non-conventional challenges. Now we have to have the resources and the will to implement. I'm going to stop there, Agop. I've talked far too much, I think. I don't know how do you run these sessions? Will there be questions and so on? I'll be happy to handle them.
Yes, thank you very much, Vahan. This was a very interesting and very informative presentation. And yes, there are questions. So the first question is from Emma Rakelian, and she says, out of the 5 categories, which one should be the top priority to concentrate on for the next 12 months in order to create a strong foundation for the other categories?
Emma, you know, I am a strong believer in an integrated approach. Everything pulls together. But if I have to put one category up front, I have to say, first, give me a government. Because all the others, there will be a lot of private efforts, and there are a lot of private efforts happening now. But please give me first a truly dedicated, functioning, competent government. And then a lot of the private side is way ahead of the public side in Armenia, way, way, way ahead. I see it every day. So if you have that competent public side, government side, and if they hook up with this private side, which is already ahead, then you'll have real fusion. Then you'll have something, then you'll have a dynamic, something coming up. As for the other sectors, I honestly cannot prioritize. They go together. One reinforces the other. Entrepreneurship, we have at the individual level, technical expertise we have. If we had this magnet to attract a lot of foreign talent, by foreign I mean Armenian, but diasporan talent, it will be dynamite.
Thank you, Vahan. The second question is from Lori Panosian. She says, how do you think the new burgeoning technology industries can be prevented from becoming monopolies like others? That has been, for example, the problem in the USA as well, like Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and so on.
Well, one day Armenia may have a mega company like that. But if it does, Google and all those others became monopolies, as far as I know, not by, but by attracting the best talents and having the best themselves, right? The best management in some ways. It wasn't a artificially created monopoly like some of the oligarchs here. The oligarchic system here is granted. They have their own monopolies by grant, by government favor, and they in return the favor to the government. It's almost everyone is like that. It's been they're nurturing each other. But the one thing here, I don't think the old oligarchs have the ability to bully themselves into this new tech area. So that is my hope. That is why I was saying, at least let them stay out of the new areas and let these new areas develop speed past them. But I don't know how we prevent one day to have a Armenian level Google or something. I honestly don't know, because that thing develops by its own dynamics. The best always attracts the best talent, and then they grow more, and then the others grow less, and then eventually, I mean, the only way to prevent this is direct government regulation, antitrust regulation. It's the only thing I've seen in the past. And antitrust regulation in Armenia, God, that's going to be a very tall order. But that's the only way any economy, even in the US, has been able to control big monopolies by antitrust regulation and intervention.
Thank you, Vahan. The third question is actually from an economist, Dr. Ruben Injikian, who is in Switzerland, I believe. And we have another economist, actually, Arakhanjan also is here. So Ruben asked, Armenia lives on remittances, which is making government lazy to think how to develop exports as new sources of foreign exchange. Export-oriented economic strategy is key development to develop exports of services through internet and sell small, high value-added goods that can be meaningfully transported by air. So I guess this is and then how to push the government towards consistent export development strategies through industrial policies is the question.
Well, that's a tough one. Again, if we had a government, it would be obvious to it. You know, this is, I mean, if the government was focused on this kind of economics now, rather than just opening borders, the advantage of this would be so obvious. Remittances are fine, but that's not a solution to become a competitive economy. If look, I'm talking about not just let's do enough so that everybody has a salary and food on the table. And if that's all we want, maybe remittances are enough. But I'm talking about how do we create a thriving, competitive economy. Otherwise, I wouldn't talk about having a niche in the supply chain, global supply chain. You don't that you need those things to be competitive and to be a presence. So depends. What is the objective? If we're going to do economic planning, or if we're going to have an economic vision towards which we go, I might as well go very high. I would like Armenia to be not just self-sufficient or not just paregetsik, as they say. No, I want Armenia to be the most dynamic, high-growth, competitive economy. And I see the potential that it can be that. For that, first you need that, as in every other case, you need a competent government. And I hate to put it that way, because now we say, okay, we don't have one now, therefore everything is hopeless. No, we're preparing the private sector. Well, everything the private sector is doing now is, I think, extremely critical for the time when that government finally comes. And I think it will come.
Thank you, Vahan.
Sorry, I know I didn't answer your question, but you know your question doesn't have a real answer. You know that. Otherwise, you wouldn't ask it.
Tim P is asking.
May I say a word?
Yes, go ahead, Ruben. Yes.
Yes. I just wanted to bring an example of one success story, Synopsis. Yes. And I became friends with Yervan Zurian, and I was surprised how he managed to build up his company in Armenia throughout all governments, and Synopsis Armenia is, I think, the most important branch of Synopsis company in so, and there are some other success stories. Maybe these success stories in IT sector can create some momentum of this export-oriented, driven by private sector, and not wait the government, because speaking frankly, Armenia is a high political risk, and it is, and even for diaspora, it is difficult to bring big investments. But with some small companies growing, and as you said, entering into supply chains of bigger systems, could create some momentum of growth. I don't know. I'm just thinking loud.
Very briefly, I totally agree with you. And those are the things I called islands of excellence. Synopsis is an island of excellence. I said it's very critical that we have these. But unless these islands of excellence eventually, over time, get integrated into the whole economy, it depends. If you're happy with just that, then we're almost there. I mean, we will have Synopsis and we will have other islands of excellence. I know a few people who are working on a different area, and we'll have islands of excellence even in certain drone technologies or robotics technologies. They're wonderful.
No, that's what I meant. Island is becoming a cluster. Cluster is becoming a part of economy, and then the whole economy. Some kind of a mutually driving process to which government has to help. If we don't have enough intelligent ministers and enough foreign direct investors, then we have to base on what we have actually.
Okay,
yes,
that's the challenge.
So the next question is from Tim P. He's asking, is it a good idea to encourage repopulation by non-Armenians as well as diasporans? Many Europeans find Armenia as an attractive place to be. So what is your answer to that?
Oh God, that's a very tricky question, very sensitive question. We have room for that because Armenia is probably one of the most homogeneous countries in the region. There are many other countries which are far less homogeneous. So we have some room for diversification. It depends which country. I mean, if the problem with that, you cannot discriminate. You cannot say, I'm going to allow, like Trump once said, Norwegians in, but not others. You remember that famous thing? Why can't the Norwegians come here? And you cannot discriminate. And if you're going to allow that, and you're going to have, and if you're going to have problems one day with the kind of new communities that emerge, ethnic communities, that's the thing that you have to worry about. But in general, I say we have some room. Armenia today is about what I think last I saw 98% Armenian. We can definitely manage a country with less than 98% ethnically Armenian, on condition these guys really bring talent. That's the part you cannot control. And that's the part where it becomes very tricky in terms of borderline, almost discriminatory or racism or whatever. Who do you let in and who you don't let in? If you can solve that problem with finesse, then it's a good idea. If you cannot solve that problem with finesse, then it could backfire.
Thank you, Vahan. The other question is from Grigor Balabanyan. He says, are the risks of opening borders with Turkey, Azerbaijan, also present just by opening transport links, for example, railways and so on? Would the latter naturally lead to the former?
See, this is one of the things that is still really unknown, vague in this last November 9 agreement. November 9 agreement talks about opening roads, railways, unblocking the blocked transportation routes. But through that, behind that, in the back of that, everybody talks about trade. Now, the way that railway is being sold in Armenia, that is, okay, it's going to go through Azerbaijan, but it's going to go all the way to Russia. We're opening a transport route to Russia, direct route to Russia, even though most of it is through Azerbaijan, and that to me is a highly vulnerable route, but anyway, it's a route to Russia. There is a very fine line here. There's a gray area of how much of this is direct freedom of trade and how much of it is just transportation routes. But what bothers me even more, there's zero clarity on what happens with direct foreign investment and what happens with rights to acquire land and property in the other country. If it's really free for all, then it's highly, very, very dangerous. But it's a good question because nobody knows. Even here, they're not sure what they're talking about. Every place I ask specifically, what does opening the border mean? They don't know.
Thank you. The other question is from the other economist. He says, Ara Khanjan is saying, how could we generate or improve the culture of statehood in Armenia?
Okay, I have... Look, there's the short term and the longer term. The real answer is the long term. Unfortunately, it will take time. And I will start with elementary schools, all the way up to high school, all the way up to college, where the way Armenian history is taught is changed, where there is courses. Well, we used to have this in Beirut, believe it or not, called civics, where they teach you citizenship. What does citizenship mean? Citizenship, where they teach you the structure of the government, what does it mean to be a citizen, what are rights and responsibilities of the citizen, why do we vote, what are the three branches of government, how do they should work, and if they historically, they haven't worked like that, what have been the consequences? We learn these things. I mean, children have to be taught this. You cannot, it doesn't just come from thin air. So this awareness of citizenship and statehood and that culture of citizenship comes from school initially, then eventually for a family and so on. Of course, that will take a whole generation. That will take 20, 25 years. In fact, if we had started this first day of independence, we would have an incredibly aware group of citizens right now, which we don't. We wasted. In fact, in many ways, the educational system has gone backwards since independence, unfortunately. So that's the long-term answer. The short-term answer, as I said before, I'm very impressed with the new generation who already have this somehow, just like some of us have it. They have it because they've seen how other countries are. They've seen they've read history. They've understood the importance of statehood through different historical periods of different countries, of empires, of kingdoms, of republics, whatever. They get it. They get the point. And if those generation over time, maybe not this next June election, but soon, maybe in the next 12 months, begin to appear on the public
any time
the short
in the
term.
universe,
That will be the
because I don't know the history of all the place. So I
Gary
cannot
Artinian,
provide
please
definitive answer,
please mute yourself.
but
Gary
it is quite
Artinian.
clear that it's a little bit it's an unusual phenomenon.
Laura, could you mute Gary Artinian, please?
But there might be similar cases that I am not aware of. So I don't want to transform here Turkey into a unique case. And at any rate, as I stressed, what I have described.
I don't know.
Okay, so Vahan, the next question is from Anya Abrahamian. She says, who are you talking to in Armenia? Because I've learned what you are talking about from experience. The hierarchy doesn't share the experience. Also, patents, are they issued in Armenia, or they tell me that most of them are issued in Russia?
That's the last question. I have to claim ignorance. I have no idea how patents are issued, honestly. Sorry about that. But as to who I'm talking to, it's a very diverse group of people, ordinary people, people in the current government, people in the opposition. I don't care. I don't belong to anything, okay? People in the legislature, a couple of members of parliament right now, a couple of advisors to high-ranking officials, but also a lot of people from the opposition. And, forget the public rhetoric. Well, I cannot say forget because it's so loud and it's so disruptive and it's so unconstructive and it's so destructive. Actually, the public political discourse in Armenia is disgusting because there's nothing constructive there. It's all blaming each other. But if you go individually to these people who are not talking from podiums or from demonstrations, there is an awareness that none of it is working. Okay, it ain't working. There is this awareness, and that gives me some hope. And I'm also talking about several members of that generation I keep talking about. I don't want to give names now, but my best hopes are tied to those people, okay? That they come, eventually organize themselves. These are so meritocrats, professionals, dedicated, really understand the value of the state, but so far have not been in politics. Nobody knows them. So the challenge is to have this group really organize itself, appear on a stage eventually, start showing their colors. Because look, people here, I've seen the polls and whoever I talk to, one thing is crystal clear. If there are elections on June 20th, more than 50% of the population will not vote to any of the existing parties. That is clear. 40 to 50% will not vote to anyone, according to the polls, and about 10% are undecided. What does this mean? This means about more than half the population of Armenia is fed up with everybody, the old, the new, the current, the past. What does that mean? That means they are ready for a new voice. They are. Anybody comes from the past blaming the present or the present blaming the past, people are so fed up, they're not even going to listen. And it's like if there is no new force coming and there is the need for it, I think what's going to happen is whoever votes will vote against someone, not for someone. Okay, that happened by the way, that happened in the U.S. So let's not be surprised. There was that negative voting also in the U.S. So a lot of people here are ready to hear a new voice. My problem, I think the problem, not my problem, but the problem is, will this group, will this generation of professionals that I'm talking about be able to organize themselves politically? Because that's not their main, that hasn't been their main preoccupation in politics, but now they see the need. So if they can organize themselves in time and present themselves to the public in time, if not by June 20, but some other time, then that's what's coming next. That's what the hope is. Other than that, I don't know. I don't think there will be much hope.
Thank you, Alan. There's a question from a phone number. I don't know his name. How do you feel about nationalizing the mines, especially given the fact that exploitation of mines is a big contributor to the depopulation, as the fertile land is destroyed and water resources are poisoned?
That's another very technical, but also international legal matter. Armenia has many international agreements, signatory to many international agreements and conventions. One has to study this very carefully, because there are serious consequences to nationalizing something. You can be put on a sanctions list. It can stop entire foreign direct investment in your country. It can be you cannot export. There are unless somebody studies very carefully every international convention that Armenia is signatory to, and the particular contracts of these miners who are here, foreign mine operators who are here, what kind of protections they have in their own agreements. You cannot just nilly-nilly nationalize. I wish we could. Honestly, I wish we could. In fact, I wish we could. I don't know, not every mine is the same. There are some extremely profitable mines with not as much environmental damage as others. But again, the devil is in the details. Which mines, what contracts, what international conventions, what legal repercussions come out, how much more damage than good will come out of it. It's something to study very cold-heartedly and rationally and scientifically. It's not something to do emotionally.
Thank you, Vahan. And that is all the questions that we have. I thank you very much for the answers, and also thank everybody for participating. Our next panel discussion actually will be a panel discussion is on fashion and design of Armenia, fashion and textile industry in Armenia. The presentation or the discussion will be co-sponsored by the Armenian American Business Council as well. And it will be held on May the 1st, Saturday again, at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. You're all invited. And again, if you know somebody who is interested in the ARPA presentations and panel discussions, please send us the email address so we can send them the information. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you, Vahan.
Good night. Oh, it's 10:30 my time, so good night.
Yes, yes. Good night to you.